Cape Cod sanctuary, her family's legacy, and fled to Bali with Lauren Brooks, leaving her homeless with a mocking 30 years of love, erased in a heartbeat, yet Emily's trembling hands didn't dial him. They clutched a hidden file instead. What devastating secret had she guarded as her marriage bled out? Was it revenge, or a mother's desperate shield for her broken kids? Hit subscribe now. Help us reach our first 1,000 supporters and uncover the truth together. The old brownstone in Boston was silent, save for the faint hum of the fridge downstairs and the occasional creak of the hardwood floor settling into the night. Emily sat on the edge of her bed, the quilt her mother had stitched decades ago bunched around her waist, its faded threads a fragile tether to a past she could still feel. At 52, she'd built a life of quiet stability, hospital administrator by day, wife and mother by every other moment. But now, that life lay shattered, its pieces glinting in the blue glow of her phone screen. She read the text again, each word a fresh stab. Sold the Cape Cod house, transferred all our savings, starting fresh with Lauren in Bali, enjoy being homeless, LOL, don't call, changing my number tomorrow. Then the video, a shaky clip of Lauren Brooks, her tanned face framed by sun-bleached hair, smirking over a piña colada. Emily, thanks for building our dream, she chirped, her voice dripping with venom as Jim's laugh rumbled in the background. The screen went black, but the sound lingered, a cruel echo in the dark. Emily's chest tightened, her breath shallow and sharp. 30 years, 3 decades of shared Christmases, of late-night talks over burnt coffee, of raising Ethan and Chloe through scraped knees and teenage storms. Gone, mocked with a casual lull. She could picture Jim now, sprawled in some overpriced villa, his graying hair slicked back, Lauren draped across him like a trophy. But as the shock sank its claws deeper, something else stirred in Emily. A cold, steady resolve. She didn't scream or sob. Instead, she set the phone down, her fingers brushing a manila folder tucked beneath her pillow. A secret she'd guarded for months. It had started last spring, subtle at first, like cracks in a dam no one notices until the flood comes. Jim, once content with his executive desk job and a belly softened by years of her cooking, suddenly obsessed over fitness. I'm taking care of myself, he'd snapped when she questioned the $500 weekly charges to elite training solutions, 2-hour sessions stretched to daily marathons. And by summer, he'd shed 30 pounds, his wardrobe swapping khakis for tight tees that showed off arms she barely recognized. She'd tried to be happy for him, tried to ignore the way his eyes slid past her at dinner, the way his phone buzzed late into the night. Then the money started vanishing. $22,000 here, $3,000 there, always just below the bank's alert threshold. She'd caught it on a credit card statement he'd left on the counter. A rare slip for a man who'd always scrutinized her every grocery receipt. When she asked, he'd waved her off. Business expenses, Em. Don't nag. But the nagging didn't stop her from noticing the password changes on their joint accounts, the hushed calls from his locked office, the business trips that matched Lauren's Instagram posts, palm trees and sunsets, tagged with new beginnings. Emily wasn't confrontational by nature. Her career thrived on observation, on piecing together patterns others missed, skills she'd honed managing a bustling hospital staff. So she watched, she waited, and when she found that draft email on his laptop, Lauren, house sells quick, we'll have 2 million, Emily won't know till it's too late. She didn't storm in with accusations. She printed it, her hands steady as she added it to the growing stack in that manila folder. Bank statements, property deeds, screenshots of his lies piling up like bricks in a wall she'd built to protect herself. The turning point came one gray afternoon in October. A migraine had sent her home early from the hospital, and she'd slipped into bed, the house quiet until Jim's voice drifted from his office. "Lauren, baby," he murmured, his tone soft and intimate, a tone she hadn't heard in years. "It's all coming together. The Cape Cod sales in motion. Once the money hits, we're gone. Bali, the dream." Emily will be left with nothing. She'd lain there, frozen, the pillow damp with silent tears, as her husband of 30 years plotted her ruin. The next day, she'd called Sarah Bennett, their family attorney, and started building her shield. Now, in the pre-dawn gloom, Emily opened that folder. Inside was a timeline. 6 months of meticulous notes. Dates of withdrawals, photos of statements, a recording she'd made when Jim thought she was at work. She'd hired a forensic accountant who'd traced a secret account Jim opened 3 months ago, and she'd copied the deed to Cape Cod, her grandmother's gift to her mother, her mother's to her. It wasn't just a house. It was her roots, her kids' inheritance, the one thing she'd sworn to protect. Her phone buzzed again, Jim still on his old number, arrogance outweighing his threats. She ignored it, typing instead. "Check your account balance, Jim." She hit send, imagining his smug grin fading as he logged in from that Bali villa, only to find the accounts frozen, triggered by evidence of his betrayal. He'd call soon, she knew, his voice a mix of rage and panic, but she wouldn't answer. Not yet. Emily stood, the folder cradled against her chest, and walked to the window. The Boston skyline glittered faintly through the mist, a city asleep while her world burned. She thought of Ethan and Chloe, 27 and 24, still innocent to their father's cruelty. How would they take this? Could she shield them from the fallout? And Jim, had he ever loved her, or had 30 years been a lie? Her reflection stared back, a woman forged anew in the fire of this night. She whispered into the dark, "You picked the wrong woman to break, Jim." What had she done to turn his victory to ash? And what would he do when he realized the game wasn't over? The answers lay ahead, but for now, she waited, a storm brewing in her silence. The first light of dawn crept through the brownstone's curtains, painting faint gold streaks across Emily Harper's kitchen table. She sat there, a steaming mug of tea untouched, the manila folder labeled Jim, evidence, spread open like a battle map. Bank statements, screenshots, that damning email draft. Each piece a brick in the fortress she'd built against her husband's betrayal. She'd sent Jim that cryptic reply, "Check your account balance," hours ago, and now her phone lay silent, its stillness a ticking bomb. But as the city woke around her, a new war brewed, one she hadn't braced for. Her own children. Ethan Mercer burst through the front door at 7:32 a.m., his dark hair tousled, his voice jagged with panic. "Mom, Dad tracked me down at the coffee shop near my apartment," he said, dropping his backpack with a thud. At 27, he was a junior architect with Jim's sharp jawline and Emily's steady eyes. But today, those eyes flickered with doubt. He said, "You're losing it." Paranoid, making up stories about him and Lauren, he begged me to talk you out of whatever you're planning, said he'd cut me and Chloe off if I didn't. His words hung heavy, a blade poised over the fragile threads still tying their family together. Emily's heart sank, a cold weight settling in her chest. She'd known Jim was ruthless, selling their Cape Cod home, draining their savings for a Bali fantasy with Lauren Brooks. But this? Turning their kids against her? She stood, hands gripping the table's edge, and forced her voice calm. "Ethan, sit down. There's something you need to hear." Chloe arrived minutes later, her coat still dusted with morning frost, her soft face, 24 years of her mother's gentleness, crumpled with worry. "Mom, what's going on? Ethan texted me about Dad. Is it true?" The kitchen filled with the ghosts of better days, Ethan's 5th birthday, Jim flipping pancakes while Chloe giggled in her high chair. Summer nights when they'd pile into the car for Cape Cod, sand still clinging to their toes as Jim carried them to bed. Now, Emily faced her children, their innocence teetering on the edge of ruin. She pulled her phone from her pocket, her thumb hovering over the play button. "Your father's been lying to us all," she said, her voice breaking despite her resolve. "Listen." The recording crackled to life, Jim's voice low and smug from that October afternoon she'd come home with a migraine. "Lauren, baby, it's all coming together," he'd whispered, unaware of her presence behind the bedroom door. "The Cape Cod sale's in motion. Once the money hits, we're gone. Bali, the dream. Ethan and Chloe will be fine. They don't need our money anyway. A laugh followed, sharp and careless, slicing through the room now like a knife. Chloe gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, while Ethan's fists clenched, knuckles whitening against the table. Mom, he said that about us? Chloe's voice trembled, tears spilling down her cheeks. Like we're nothing to him? Ethan stood, pacing the linoleum, his breath ragged. He's my dad. He taught me how to ride a bike, how to tie for my first job interview. How could he just... His voice cracked and he turned away, shoulders shaking. Emily crossed the room, pulling Chloe into her arms, feeling her daughter's sobs soak through her sweater. She reached for Ethan, but he flinched, caught between fury and disbelief. I didn't want you to hear this, Emily whispered, her own tears threatening to spill. I wanted to protect you, to keep you from this mess. But he's forcing my hand. She thought of all the nights she'd lain awake, debating whether to tell them, shield them from the truth, or arm them with it. Had she waited too long? Was dragging them into this war a betrayal of her own? The questions gnawed at her, but Jim's move had left her no choice. Ethan spun back, eyes blazing. I'm with you, Mom. Whatever you're doing. I'm in. Chloe nodded through her tears, clinging tighter. Me too. I can't believe he'd do this. Their loyalty was a lifeline, but it came with a cost. Emily saw it in their shattered trust, the way their childhood memories now carried a stain. She'd won them over, but at what price? The doorbell rang, sharp and insistent, cutting through the tension. Emily opened it to find Sarah Bennett, her family attorney, briefcase in hand and a grim set to her jaw. Emily, we need to talk, Sarah said, stepping inside. She glanced at Ethan and Chloe, then lowered her voice. Jim's playing dirty. If he's pulling the kids into this, he's banking on emotional blackmail to weaken you. The court won't care about feelings, they'll look at evidence. But if Ethan and Chloe waver, it could sway a judge against us. Emily nodded, ushering Sarah to the table. They've heard the truth now. They're with me. Emergency court orders she'd filed 3 weeks ago to freeze Jim's accounts, based on the evidence Emily had painstakingly gathered. Good, Sarah said, because he's not stopping. My contact at the bank says he tried accessing the accounts from Bali an hour ago. Failed, of course, thanks to those orders. He'll know soon enough. He's trapped. Emily's phone buzzed again, Jim's name flashing. She let it ring, watching the screen until it went dark. He's panicking, she said, a faint smile tugging at her lips. Sarah raised an eyebrow. That's a start. But we're not out of the woods. He's got money hidden somewhere. I can feel it. We need to find it before he does something desperate. The kitchen grew quiet, the weight of Sarah's words settling over them. Emily looked at her children, Ethan's clenched jaw, Chloe's red-rimmed eyes, and felt a pang of guilt. She'd pulled them into this storm, but she couldn't shield them anymore. I'm sorry, she said softly. I never wanted this for us. Chloe squeezed her hand. It's not your fault, Mom. It's his. Outside, the Boston morning hummed to life. Cars honking, neighbors calling to their dogs. Inside, Emily's world was fracturing, piece by piece. Jim's betrayal had torn through their money, their home, now their family. What would he try next? Could she hold them together through the wreckage? And deep down, a whisper she couldn't silence. Had I fought harder for him, could I have stopped this? The answers were out there, waiting in the chaos ahead. The clock on Emily Harper's kitchen wall ticked past 9 a.m. Each second, a hammer strike against the fragile calm she'd clung to since dawn. Sarah Bennett sat across from her, legal papers fanned out like a deck of cards in a high-stakes game, while Ethan and Chloe hovered nearby, their faces still raw from the morning's revelations. Emily's tea had gone cold, its steam long vanished, mirroring the chill creeping up her spine. Jim's betrayal had already fractured her family. Now it threatened to strip them bare, and time was running out. Sarah's voice cut through the haze. I got a call from the forensic accountant an hour ago, she said, tapping a highlighted line on a bank statement. Jim moved $500,000 to an offshore account, JB Trust, Bali, 2 weeks ago, before we filed the emergency orders. It's separate from the joint accounts we froze. She leaned forward, her hazel eyes sharp. If we don't find it before he leaves the States for good, that money's gone. And with it, your kid's future. Emily's breath caught, her mind racing back to the Cape Cod house. Its weathered shingles, the porch where her grandmother had taught her to braid daisies, the sandy path she'd walked with Ethan and Chloe every summer. That $500,000 wasn't just cash. It was their inheritance, their security, the last piece of her family's legacy Jim hadn't torched. She gripped the table, nails digging into the wood. He's flying out tomorrow night, she said, voice steady despite the storm inside. We've got less than 36 hours. Sarah nodded, flipping open her laptop. I've requested an emergency hearing with Judge Carlo Rodriguez this afternoon to expand the freeze order. But we need proof of that account. Account number, bank name, something concrete, or she'll deny it. Jim's been careful. He's routing it through shell companies. Without hard evidence, he walks away with $500,000 and we're left scrambling. The room spun, a dizzying mix of fear and fury. Emily thought of Jim's smug LOL, Lauren's taunting video, the way he'd laughed about leaving Ethan and Chloe with nothing. She'd already lost her marriage. Could she lose this too? Then a memory flashed. A crumpled post-it she'd glimpsed in Jim's office trash weeks ago, scribbled with JB Trust and a string of numbers. Her pulse quickened. Wait here, she told Sarah, bolting upstairs. Jim's office was a shrine to his old life. Mahogany desk, framed photos of corporate handshakes, a golf trophy gathering dust. She tore through drawers, papers scattering like leaves in a gale until her fingers brushed the trash bin. There it was, yellowed and creased. The post-it stared up at her. JB Trust, Bali 78423911056. Her hands shook as she clutched it, a lifeline in the chaos. But would it be enough? She raced back, slamming it onto the table. Is this it? Sarah snatched it, scanning the digits. Maybe. It's a start. But we need to confirm it's active. Banks won't just hand over records without a court order, and we don't have time for that. She paused, chewing her lip. Unless you know someone who can dig faster. Emily froze. She did know someone. Jake Russo, a wiry ex-patient from her hospital days, a former hacker who'd cleaned up his act after she'd pushed for his parole. He'd left her his number years ago, a gruff, I owe you one, scribbled on a napkin. Could she cross that line? She met Sarah's gaze, the unspoken question hanging between them. I'll call him, Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper, but this stays off the record. Jake answered on the second ring, his gravelly voice unchanged. Harper, what's up? She explained. Jim, the account, the ticking clock. Her words tumbling over each other, he whistled low. Offshore's tricky, but I can try. Need 24 hours and $10,000. Cash, untraceable. You in? Emily hesitated, glancing at Ethan and Chloe. 10 grand from her personal savings, money she'd stashed for emergencies. Was it worth it? Was it right? Do it, she said finally, the weight of her choice settling like stone. Night fell, a restless shroud over Boston's skyline. Emily paced her living room, the kids asleep upstairs, their trust in her a fragile shield against the guilt gnawing at her core. She'd hired a hacker, broken the law maybe, to save what Jim was stealing. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd spent 30 years building an honest life, only to bend it now. She sank onto the couch, staring at a faded photo. Jim proposing under a rain-soaked oak, her laughing as water dripped from his hair. Where did you go, Jim? She murmured, tears stinging her eyes. And why am I still fighting for us? Her phone jolted her awake at 2 a.m. Jake, got it, he rasped. JB, Trust, Bank of Cayman, $500,000 deposited 10 days ago. Jim tried accessing it from Bali tonight, locked out thanks to your freeze. Emailing you the proof now. Relief flooded her, but it was bittersweet. She forwarded it to Sarah, who texted back. Hearings at 8 a.m. We've got him. 2 hours before Jim's flight. Close. Too close. Emily stood at her window, the city's lights blurring through her tears. She'd won this round, but at what cost? 10 grand gone, a favor from a gray past. Had she tainted herself to beat him? And Jim? Did he know she'd outmaneuvered him yet? Her phone buzzed again, his name glaring on the screen. She let it ring, imagining his rage echoing across oceans. "You're not the only one who can play dirty," she whispered. The morning loomed, a battle line drawn. Sarah would face Judge Rodriguez armed with Jake's proof, but Emily's mind churned. What else was Jim hiding? Could she trust her own choices now? And her kids, would they forgive her if they knew how far she'd gone? The Post-it lay crumpled on the table, a tiny victory in a war far from over. Outside, the wind howled, carrying secrets yet to break. The Boston courthouse loomed like a gray fortress under a bruised November sky, its marble halls echoing with the shuffle of feet and the murmur of strained voices. Emily Harper sat at the plaintiff's table, her spine rigid, hands folded tightly over the manila folder that had become her shield. Sarah Bennett flanked her, crisp in a navy suit, her laptop open to the evidence Jake Russo had unearthed at 2 a.m., proof of Jim's $500,000 offshore stash. Ethan and Chloe sat behind her, their presence a silent anchor, their faces etched with a mix of dread and hope. Today, after months of shadows, the truth would face the light, or be buried forever. Across the room, James Jim Carter slouched beside his attorney, Gregory Powell, a slick litigator with a reputation for twisting facts into knots. Jim looked haggard, his Bali tan faded to a sickly pallor, his eyes darting between Emily and the judge's bench. He'd landed at Logan International Airport last night, served with court papers the moment he cleared customs thanks to Sarah's orchestration. Emily caught his gaze once, a flicker of the man she'd married 30 years ago, but she turned away, focusing on Judge Carla Rodriguez as she entered, her black robe sweeping like a storm cloud. "We're here on Harper versus Carter," Judge Rodriguez began, her voice a steady drum beat. "Temporary asset protection orders were issued 3 weeks ago based on evidence of financial abandonment and attempted fraud. Let's proceed." Sarah stood, presenting the timeline. Jim's secret account, the Cape Cod sale, the Bali plan, each fact a nail in his coffin, capped by Jake's late-night find. The courtroom hummed, tension coiling like a spring. Then Powell rose, his smile oily. "Your Honor, this is a misunderstanding blown out of proportion," he said, sliding a printed text across the table. "My client sent a regrettable message in jest, but here's proof Mrs. Harper agreed to sell the Cape Cod property." The screen flashed with a fabricated exchange. "Jim, go ahead and sell the house. I'm fine with it." Gasps rippled through the gallery. Emily's stomach dropped, her pulse hammering. It was a lie, crude, brazen, but the words stared back, mocking her. Sarah whispered urgently, "They've doctored it. If we don't counter this now, the judge might buy it." Emily's mind raced. How had Jim faked this? Then Lauren Brooks stepped forward, summoned as a witness, her heels clicking on the marble. She looked smaller than in the video, her blonde hair pulled tight, her eyes glistening with rehearsed tears. "Jim told me, Emily signed divorce papers months ago," she said, voice quavering. "He said she wanted out. I never meant to hurt anyone. I thought it was mutual." The room tilted. Ethan gripped the bench, his knuckles white, while Chloe stifled a sob. Emily felt their trust waver. Could they doubt her now? Powell smirked, sensing blood. "Your Honor, Mrs. Harper's actions suggest consent, not victimhood. We request the orders be lifted." Judge Rodriguez leaned forward, peering over her glasses. "Mrs. Bennett, your response?" Sarah hesitated, but Emily stood, her voice trembling yet firm. "Your Honor, I have proof Jim's lying, and Lauren too." She pulled her phone from her purse, hands shaking as she cued the recording. The one she'd held back, the dagger she'd hoped never to unsheathe. Jim's voice filled the room, smug and clear from that Bali call she'd intercepted. "Lauren, just say Emily agreed. She's got nothing to fight with. We'll be sipping cocktails by next week." A pause, then laughter, his and Lauren's, intertwined like a twisted hymn. The courtroom erupted. Lauren's face crumpled, her tears replaced by fury. "You bastard! You told me!" she shrieked, lunging toward Jim before a bailiff restrained her. She spun to the judge, wild-eyed. "He lied to me too? I'm done!" She stormed out, her exit a thunderclap, leaving Jim alone, shrinking in his seat. Powell's smirk vanished, his notes fluttering to the floor. Judge Rodriguez banged her gavel, silencing the chaos. "Mr. Carter, explain yourself?" Jim stumbled to the stand, his voice a hoarse rasp. "It was a mistake, Your Honor, a midlife crisis. I never meant to." Rodriguez cut him off, her tone ice. "You meant to leave your wife homeless, as your text so eloquently put it. And now you've fabricated evidence?" She turned to Emily. "Mrs. Harper, anything further?" Emily met Jim's eyes, pleading now, rimmed red, and felt a pang of old love, a ghost of their rain-soaked beginning. "No, Your Honor," she said softly. "The truth's out." The ruling came swift and sharp. "The court finds overwhelming evidence of fraud and contempt," Rodriguez declared. "The asset freeze remains, expanded to include the offshore account. Mr. Carter surrenders his passport. A financial guardian will oversee all marital assets pending divorce. Mrs. Harper retains exclusive use of the Boston home and Cape Cod property." She fixed Jim with a stern glare. "You're lucky your wife stopped you before you succeeded, Mr. Carter. Next time, choose your midlife crisis wisely." As the gavel fell, Ethan and Chloe rushed to Emily, their arms enveloping her in a tear-streaked embrace. "You did it, Mom," Chloe whispered while Ethan's voice broke. "I saw him cry as they took him out. I feel bad for him." Emily's heart twisted, 30 years of memories clashing with the wreckage of today. She'd won, but the victory tasted of ash. Jim approached, escorted by a bailiff, his voice cracking. "Em, please." "I'm sorry. Where do I go now?" She looked at him, the man who'd once been her world, and said, "You should have thought of that before, Jim." The courtroom emptied, leaving Emily with Sarah and the kids. Her phone buzzed. Ryan Mercer, Jim's brother. He's begging to see you before this ends. He's a mess." She stared at the message, torn. Could she face him again? Did he deserve that chance? Ethan's words echoed, "I feel bad for him." And she wondered, was there still a shred of the man she'd loved, or was this just another play? Outside, the wind whipped through Boston's streets, carrying the day's weight away. Emily clutched her folder, the battle won, but the war unresolved. What would Jim do next? And could she ever forgive the father her kids still mourned? The answers waited, sharp and uncertain, in the days ahead. 6 months had passed since the courthouse gavel fell, its echo fading into a new rhythm for Emily Harper. The October sun dipped low over Cape Cod, casting golden ribbons across the waves as she sat on the weathered porch of her family's beach house. The divorce was final, inked 3 weeks ago, awarding her the house outright, 70% of their retirement savings, and full legal fees paid by Jim. He'd walked away with a beat-up sedan and just enough cash for a dingy apartment near Boston's outskirts. Victory should have felt sweet, but as Emily cradled a mug of chamomile tea, the taste was bittersweet, tinged with the ghosts of what once was. The brownstone in Boston was hers alone now, its silence no longer oppressive but peaceful, a canvas for her to repaint her life. Ethan and Chloe had moved forward too. Ethan pouring himself into his architecture projects, Chloe finding solace in her graduate studies, yet the scars lingered. That afternoon, Chloe appeared at the porch steps, her auburn hair catching the breeze, her eyes soft but heavy. "Mom," she said, sitting beside Emily, "Dad called me last night. He was crying. Said he's sorry, that he wants to see us again. He sounded broken." Emily's breath hitched, her fingers tightening around the mug. She'd seen Jim's tears in court, heard his pleas as the bailiff led him away. But this was different. A crack in the armor of the man who'd texted LOL while torching their world. She set the mug down, staring at the horizon, where sea met sky. "What did you tell him?" she asked, her voice barely above the waves' whisper. Chloe hesitated, twisting a strand of hair. "I said I'd talk to you. Ethan thinks we should hear him out, but I don't know, Mom. After everything, can we..." The question hung like fog, thick with memory. Emily saw Jim in flashes, The young man who'd knelt under a rain-soaked oak 30 years ago, his grin wide as he slid a ring onto her trembling finger. The father who'd hoisted Ethan onto his shoulders at Cape Cod, who'd sung Chloe to sleep with off-key lullabies. Then the other Jim, the one who'd plotted with Lauren Brooks, who'd laughed about leaving them destitute. Her throat burned, tears spilling as she turned to Chloe. "I don't hate him," she said, voice cracking. "I never wanted him broken. I just wanted us safe." Chloe's arms wrapped around her, a quiet sob escaping. "I'm proud of you, Mom. You fought for us when he wouldn't." They sat there, mother and daughter, the ocean's lullaby weaving through their shared grief. Emily thought of Ethan's words from court, "I feel bad for him," and wondered if her kids could still see the father they'd loved beneath the wreckage. Could she? The phone buzzed in her pocket. "Ryan Mercer, Jim's brother again. A man? He's begging to see you. He's a mess. Lost his job, living off scraps, says he'll do anything to make it right." She didn't reply, the weight of choice pressing down. A year to the day after Jim's cruel text, Emily stood at a podium in Boston University's conference center, the room packed with over 200 faces, mostly women, their eyes reflecting stories like hers. "Financial security after betrayal," the banner read, a workshop she'd built with Sarah Bennett and financial experts, born from her own ashes. She spoke, her voice steady now. "Preparation isn't paranoia, it's power. I lost a marriage, but I found strength I didn't know I had." The crowd nodded, some wiping tears, others scribbling notes. Then, an older woman approached, her frail hand grasping Emily's. "My husband of 42 years left me for someone half my age," she said, voice trembling. "I read about you in the Globe, your fight. I got a lawyer, saved my home, thank you." Her eyes shone with gratitude, and Emily pulled her into a hug, tears streaming down her own cheeks. Not from pain, but from purpose. She'd turned her ruin into a beacon, a light for others lost in the dark. Ethan and Chloe sat in the front row, beaming, their pride a balm to her wounds. Driving home along the coastal road, the Cape Cod house waiting in the distance, Emily felt a peace she hadn't known in years. The radio hummed softly, the sky a tapestry of dusk. Then her phone lit up. A text from an unknown number. "Emily, I'm not done yet." Jay attached was a grainy photo, Lauren Brooks, arm looped through a silver-haired man's, a private jet gleaming behind them. Emily's grip tightened on the wheel, her pulse spiking. Was Jim bluffing from his broken life, or plotting anew? And Lauren, had she moved on to another mark, or was this tied to him still? She pulled over, the ocean's roar filling the silence. Ryan's words echoed. "He'll do anything to make it right." Clashing with this threat, could Jim be both penitent and vengeful? Should she meet him, hear his plea, or lock him out forever? The kids' faces flashed. Ethan's pity, Chloe's doubt. And she wondered what they'd choose. Her fingers hovered over the phone, torn between reply and delete. Then she looked up, the stars piercing the night, and made her decision. She'd face tomorrow, whatever it brought, on her terms. The car hummed back to life, tires crunching gravel as she headed home. The Cape Cod house loomed ahead, its lights warm against the dark, a sanctuary she'd fought for, a future she'd claimed. "Sometimes," she whispered, "strength isn't revenge. It's rising again." But as the sea whispered back, questions lingered. Would Jim's shadow return? Could Lauren's game snare her still, and her kids? Could they heal with a father half redeemed, half lost? The answers drifted out there, beyond the waves, waiting to surface. For now, Emily drove on, a woman remade, not by what she'd lost, but by what she'd found within.